At this point, we have a working date picker component, but we have one problem that for up until now I have avoided talking about. Let's go back into our main scene. I'm going to go into this calendar view scene, and if I preview this, our component should be working, right? It's working. I can select the date. Right? Everything's working. Exactly what you'd expect. But watch what happens now. I'm going to take this component and I'm going to move it up here. And let's zoom out just a little bit. And let's bring another one in. Now I've got two date picker components in my scene. And if I preview this, you're going to see that if I click this left and right, see how this down here is updating? And if I do this one left and right, this is updating. And if I choose a date, right, it's updating. And if I go forward over here and I choose another date, notice how these two are interfering with each other. And the reason why that is happening, it's all in how we've been sending our messages. So if we go back into the component here, we're sending this message, date picker set day. We're sending it to the scene, which means that anything in the scene configured to listen for that message will respond to it. And that message is being received here in calendar day. Right here. And not only is it being received by all the ones in the component that I clicked in, but it's also being received by all the ones in the component that I didn't click in. What we need is a way to identify where that click originated from. If I click next or previous in the first component, I want it to only be received by the ones in my first component. And similarly, if I click down here, I only want these ones down here to react and these ones to not. Now, there's no way in ProtoPie for me to send this message only to child components. Your options are send it to the scene or send it to a particular component. I can send it to a child component, right? So it's either send to one or send to everything. I don't have a way to say send to all the calendar day components only within this component. I don't have the ability to do that. So what we need is inside our calendar day component, we are going to be receiving this message regardless. I want a way to ignore this message if it didn't come from within my own date picker component. In order to do that, we are going to give a unique ID to the date picker component. And then in our scene, I'm going to be able to configure this one with one ID and this one with a different ID. And it doesn't matter what those IDs are as long as they're not the same. And then with all of the messages that we're sending through in our component, we're going to include that ID. And these components are going to know. It's going to know that I am a child of ID 1 versus I am a child of ID 3 or ID 7 or, however many date pickers you have in your scene. Whatever the ID is set for that parent, the child is going to know what ID it's part of. And it's going to say, okay, well, if this message contains the ID of the component that I am a part of, then I'll respond to it. Otherwise, I'm going to ignore it. So let's go back into our date component and let's set this up. Let's create a variable, and I'm going to call this date picker ID. Date underscore picker underscore ID. This is going to be a number, and I'm going to make this overridable. And by default, I'm going to set this to 1. Doesn't really matter what I set it to, but I like it as 1 and not 0. So I'm going to say by default it'll be 1. But I will be able to change that. So if we go back into our scene and I've got date picker 1, it has the value 1. This one I can set to something else. So let's set it to 2. So in my scene, the second one has the ID 2. Let's go back into our component. And these two variables, these are configurations. They are what you would refer to in programming as constants, meaning that they never change. They are set once and then they stay that way. And that's why I've used this uppercase with underscore to signify that. Where the other ones, they have this what's called camel case, where you've got lowercase with uppercase dividing up each of the words. It's called camel case. These are used for variables that will change. And because these are configurations, I like to have them at the top of the list. It doesn't affect anything if you don't do this. This is just an organizational thing that I like to do. All right, so my date picker ID. The first thing I need my component to do is to tell all the child components what ID they're a part of. And as I mentioned before, my options are send to a specific component or send to every component regardless of where it lives. In this case, I'm going to have to send individually to all 37 instances of my calendar day component. I'm only going to have to do this once though. After that, it will be easy. It'll just be a matter of comparing numbers against each other. But during this initial phase, I'm going to need to send to every single one of these the date picker ID. So for the moment, I'm going to just turn this off. And I could put sends, right? I'm going to send to child component day 1 or day 0, message, set, date picker ID, and send the value of date picker ID. Right? And then I would duplicate this. This will be for day 1 and duplicate it again and so forth. I don't want to put this in my start trigger. That's going to make my start trigger really long. So instead, here, let me get rid of this and I'm going to cut this. So Command X, and instead I'm going to make another receive, add trigger, receive, and this will be from my current component, and I'm going to call this initialize. And right here we're going to say receive initialize from self. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste that. And actually, let me set this up just in case you didn't copy that. I'll do it for you right here. So I'm going to send to child component, and I'm going to select day 0. And now when I did this before, I used the message set date picker ID. But as we're going to see, this message is going to be used to send more than one bit of information eventually. So instead, I'm going to send the message init, short for initialize. And for now, all I'm going to do is send date picker ID. We're going to change this later, but I'm going to send that along. Send init. And then I need to duplicate this for every single one in my component in here. This is tedious, but I promise this will be the only time you have to do this inside this component. So let's duplicate this for day 1, duplicate again for day 2, and the rest of these I'll just do really quick. Okay, so I've sent this message now to every single one of my components. I need something to kick off this initialize, so let's add a send down here. Let's do a send to current component. Remember, it is sending initialize. And like I've been doing all along, send initialize to self. And here, let's move these guys down here, and let's put this all up to the top actually, because I really want to initialize those components before I do anything else. So this represents the order in my head how things are happening. Generally speaking, they're all happening simultaneously, but I like to put these in a logical order that makes sense in my head as to how things are happening. So send initialize to self. It's going to send all of these. Now my component needs to receive this message. So let's go into the calendar day component. And I like to have the messages for like initialization messages. I like to have these up near the top. So I'm going to right click, add trigger, and this is going to be a receive, which is right there. And I'm receiving this from parent. This is important. Whenever you send to a particular component, the counterpart is receive from parent. So choose receive from parent, and the message you should get is init. And I want to assign this to a variable, and I'm going to make one over here. I'm going to call this date picker ID. And let's just assign it to that. Now, once again, it's important that we get this right. So temporarily, I'm just going to update the label of this with the ID of the date picker. So let's do this. I'm going to use a text response on the label and formula. And this will just be date picker ID. Let's go back into our scene. And we have this first one. It's configured with the ID 1, which matches what we currently already have on this. Let's change this to something else. Change this to 5. This one's already set to 2. So when I preview this, I expect this to be 5s across the board, and I expect this to be 2s across the board. So let's just make sure. Let's go to preview. And there we go. I have 5s across the board and 2s across the board. So I've properly set this up. I'm sending that message correctly to all of my child components. If you see anything in here that's not a 5 in this first one or not a 2 in this second one, go back and make sure that you've correctly sent the message to all of your components in this init routine. Okay, let's go back into our calendar day, and I don't need this text in here. This is now working. I'm going to get rid of that. Let's go back into our date picker component, and now I want to turn this back on. Now, there's going to be an interesting thing that's happening here. When I send this message, send date picker set day, I also want to include the date picker ID with it. So that way I can effectively respond to it if the message came from my own date picker, and then ignore it if it came from a different one. So let's go back in here, and we're going to add another index to our message over here. And I'm going to add it to the end over here. So let's put a comma here, and we have something in the middle here, and this is now going to be the date picker ID. So let's just choose date picker ID right there. Say okay to that. And I am going to need that. So let's take all of this, say okay to that, and we're going to need that in this one as well. Anytime we're sending these messages back and forth, we want to make sure that we include date picker ID. Oh, we've got too much in there. I want it to be like this. And oh, we need a comma here as well. Let's just make sure that we've got our comma. So that one has a comma, and this one also has a comma. Okay, say okay to that. We want to make sure that these messages have things in the same order. So the first index is always the start day. Second one is number of days in the month. Third one is selected day. Fourth one is date picker ID. This one needs to be the same. First one is start day. Second one is days a month. Third one, that's this right here, is selected day, which in this case, -1 for the selected day is not in this month, followed by the date picker ID. And let's just update this. So selected, not in this, selected day. Selected date. All right. In our calendar day component, I want to put a condition that will either accept this message and respond to it or ignore it. So let's do this. Let's add a condition. And I'm going to use a formula here. If parse JSON, and that was, remember, set data is our array. Index 3, that's the fourth index, equals, and I'm going to choose date picker ID. Why didn't I use an assign here and do this? And this is something that is important to understand. I'm not doing any kind of a mathematical comparison here. So I'm not doing a greater than, a less than, or doing some math with it. Because I'm just saying if whatever that is equals this. So even though this is giving me text, and this variable is not a text, it's number, ProtoPie will be able to compare text against the number, and it will be able to work that out. It's only when I need to do some kind of math here. So for example, right here, I need to do, if index is less than start day, I need start day to be a number type, and that's where that matters. That's why I need to do it here. So I'm going to say message from my picker. And I'm going to take all of this stuff and put it underneath. If the message is from my picker, then I'm going to do all of this stuff and process the day. If not, I'm just going to ignore it. Going to do absolutely nothing. Let's see if that worked. Let's go back into our calendar view. And I expect this now to ignore when I do my month generation. So if I hit next, okay, this month is updating here. And if I go previous, this month is updating here. And if I go next here, there we go. This month is updating here. And this month is updating here, but not up here, which is great. I now need to do the same thing for date selection. I definitely don't want to select it in two places. Let's go back into our calendar date. Right here, when I tap here, I've got this message, date picker select day. And right now I'm just sending the label. Well, I want to do what I've been doing this whole time, and I want to send multiple bits of information. So I'm once again going to build an array. I'm going to use quote, square bracket, quote, plus. and then plus, quote, comma, plus, and then I'm going to include date picker ID. And then I need to close the array with the other square bracket. Say OK to that. And then this is now receiving this message selection. Remember when I said that I wanted to set this up because this is going to be receiving more information? Well, now it is. Now it's receiving both of those things. It's receiving selection. Currently, selection is text, or is a number, but I need it to be text because now I'm sending text through. So this selection I'm going to change to text. And now I need to make this a little bit more robust. And what I need to say is I need to change this to a formula. And I'm going to say if parse JSON of select data, or selection I should say, and then the first index, which is the selected day, equals text, and formula, and let's copy this guy. And the second index is my date picker ID. If this message came from my own date picker ID, then I'm going to do this. And similarly, I want the inverse for this. So I'm actually going to get rid of this and duplicate this because I don't want to redo these things. I just want to change this first one to be does not equal to. Here, I still need to have this. So whether I'm making this into its selected or not selected state, I still need to check to make sure that this message came from within my own date picker. If it didn't, I want to ignore it. I do not want to change the state, whether I'm making it selected or unselected. I only want to change its state if that message came from its own picker. And then I'm going to set this to 0. And then lastly, I need to do that from within my date picker component. And when I receive this message, date picker select day, right now I'm assigning it to this variable day. But I'm going to make another variable over here called selection because I need to do the same thing. Selection. It needs to be text. And let's now, instead of making this go directly to day, I'm going to make this go to selection. And let's now make a condition. And my condition is if. I'm going to use a formula here. This will be parse JSON. Let's make this a bit bigger here. I'm going to use that selection variable. And the second index, so that's index 1. If it equals date picker ID. All right, let's take this and I'm going to move it down here. And now this selected day, I'm no longer assigning to this day variable. And in fact, I don't really need this anymore because I'm going to now just use the first index directly here. So let's paste this in here and I'm going to put 0. I don't need this day variable anymore. Now let's see if this works. I should be able to go left and right independently, and I should be able to make a selection. Oops. Okay, my selection isn't working, and we need now to figure out why that is. Let's go back into our calendar day, and let's do something here. In order to help us figure out what's going on, I want to put on my screen what that message is. So let's do this. I'm going to create a text variable here, and I'm going to put it over top of my blank space down here in the bottom. I'm going to call this text layer, I'm going to call it debug. And I want to make sure it's above all of my elements here. So let's just put it above everything. And let's collapse these guys. And when this message, date picker select day, when it's received, I'm just going to update that text layer. So I'm going to use text, debug, formula, and the value is selection. So let's just make sure that, first of all, our message has the right information. Go back in here, and let's preview this. And the second I make a selection, Okay, so now I'm seeing 13, 5, and that makes sense because I clicked on day 13 and the date picker ID of this first component is 5. If I click on one down here, I should see 2. Okay, so the message is being sent correctly. Let's go take a look inside our component here where we are receiving this. And I want to say, so okay. I am checking the wrong thing. So remember, I'm getting this message and I'm assigning it to the variable selection. My condition here is actually looking for selected, not selection. So let's change this to selection. And I'm going to copy this because I'm going to need this in a few places. There. Here. It gets a little bit confusing because I got this selection to indicate the data that is coming along with this message, and then I've got this selected as the state of it being selected. Okay. Let's do something a little bit more robust here to help us tell the difference between what these variables are doing. Let's change this thing selection. Let's change it to selection data. And let's make sure that this is selection data, and we'll make sure that this hasn't broken. So we still have selection data. That's good. This one, selected. Let's change this to selected state. And okay, we see we've broken a couple of things here. So let's go back and fix that. I'm going to change this to selected state. And selected state here is going to be there. And let's just take a look here. Assign selected state. So let's change this. Naming your variables is important that you do it in such a way that they're not ambiguous. Now I can tell the difference between, okay, selected day, that's the day that's selected. Selected state, this now represents the selected state of the component itself. And selection data, this is the group of data that's coming through this date picker select day receive. Now let's go back in here. Let's see if that's fixed our problem. So I can select one day. Okay, well, it's still not setting our selection in here. Let's go back to our date picker UI. Let's do it in here. Let's see, because here's where we have all our debug on. We are receiving our selected day. So what we're not doing is we're not changing the state inside the calendar day component. We are getting our date selection, but what we are missing here is we are changing selected state here. So if the selected date, that's index 0, equals the label's text, and selected data 1 equals our date picker ID, then this should now become 1. Okay, we haven't done anything wrong, but sometimes ProtoPie doesn't like it when you change the name of variables in there, and the old name kind of gets stuck in there. And sometimes what you need to do is you just kind of need to force it. So right here, what I'm going to do is just arbitrarily, I'm going to update the text label. So let's take this label, and I'm going to take the formula, and I'm just going to copy the selected date. So that's this one right here. Copy that. And I'm going to update the label with that value before I even do any of my conditions. And I'll go back here and let's just check it. And now we should see everything changes to 20. If I click it again, there we go. Now it is going purple. I don't know why ProtoPie does this. Sometimes you need to deal with this where you haven't really done anything wrong, but for whatever reason, it doesn't like it. So let that be a lesson. Try to name your variables appropriately when you first create them, as opposed to changing them later, because if you change them later, sometimes things like this can happen. Now let's remove that from this calendar day component, and where do I have that? I can remove this, and now this should be working. So let's go back into our calendar view, and now when I go left and right, I should be able to select the date, and notice how that date is only being selected in that first one, and if I go and select the date over here, they are no longer conflicting with each other.